for neurodivergent people and their families. That's my business. I'm also an assistant professor of mental health nursing at Northumbria University. So I'm an academic where I teach mental health nurses how to be nurses. And all of my research is around the lived experience of neurodivergence and the concept of neurodiversity and different ways of thinking about neurodiversity. Prior to my time as an academic, I was in a ADHD and autism assessment service as a mental health nurse, a psychiatric nurse, where I would work with children, young people, and their families around giving assessments and diagnoses of ADHD and autism predominantly, and then post-diagnosis support. What I also like to talk about is I'm also neurodivergent. So I have a diagnosis of ADHD. I was diagnosed ADHD when I was 5 years old. I recognized that I was also autistic at around 29 years old. I'm 34 now. And I lived my life with a diagnosis. I lived my life with the stigma and the discrimination and the marginalization that can happen when you're a neurodivergent person. I was born in the northeast of England, so I have very much an English perspective of that, personally. But as I say, I've spoken a lot internationally and trying to gain differing perspectives of neurodivergence. I I put this picture in as well because I'm going to talk about some of the challenges around neurodiversity today and around neurodivergence, but I also want to talk about the positives and celebrate the positives and the wonderful experiences that we can have as neurodivergent people when we have the right support, when we have the right facilitation, when we have early intervention, and then when we can have lives that are fulfilling and wonderful and beautiful, and again we can achieve and be successful in the ways that we want to be. So I want to start this talk by really framing that there are lots of different ways to think about neurodiversity, and none of these ways are correct. I'm not going to come to this talk and tell you that this is the right way to do it, because I don't think that's right. I don't think that's ethical. I very much just want to give different perspectives, and for the delegates and people in the audience to be able to take what's useful to you and helpful for you in your communities, in your cultural context, in your country's context, in your community context, and take that whatever's helpful and use that, and whatever's unhelpful you don't need to use. So there's no correct way to think about neurodiversity, but you'll notice that I've already used these terms neurodiversity and neurodivergence. So for the sake of simplicity, how I am using those terms, neurodiversity is a broad term to describe the natural variation in all of our brains. And we are a neurodiverse community, we are a neurodiverse population, global population. But when I use the term neurodivergent, I am specifically talking about people who fulfill the criteria for some of the diagnoses that we might use in this space. So I'm talking about autistic people, people with ADHD, dyslexic, dyscalculic, dyspraxic, etc. So that you'll notice I'll revert now to using the term neurodivergent predominantly. So but as I say, there's lots of different ways of thinking about neurodiversity as an introduction, and I wanted to position three core ways, ways of knowing, ways of conceptualizing, ways of thinking about it. The first way, well, I'm sure many of you might be aware of, is this medical diagnostic model. So in a medical diagnostic model, we position ADHD, autism, and other conditions as neurodevelopmental disorders. This neurodevelopmental disorder framing says that neurodivergent people like myself, we have cognitive brain differences that occur in early development and that they can make life harder. They can make certain aspects of life more difficult, they can be impairing, but they are also more medically framed. So they're coming from that medical perspective. Now, I'm going to challenge this perspective a little bit later on, but this is the dominant way in which neurodiversity is typically spoken about across the globe. So in this biomedical model, this medical perspective, what we see is the term neurodevelopmental disorders being used to group people. And the positioning that these conditions, these differences are brain-based and they're individual. So people with ADHD have different brains to the average person or the typical person. People who are autistic have a brain-based difference. Now we're going to challenge some of that thinking in a little bit, but that's how it's typically framed medically. With that in mind, the biomedical model can be really helpful because what it does is it prioritizes treatment and it prioritizes intervention to reduce impairment. So what I mean by that is if someone has ADHD and they really struggle with attentional focus, a medical perspective would look to use medication or an intervention to improve that attentional focus. And that can be really helpful. That can be life-saving for some people. But it ignores, this medical model ignores some really important parts about what it means to be a neurodivergent person, which we'll get to later. The medical model is very disability focused, and diagnosis focused. So it positions people as disabled people. Now, you in an African context and in a sort of Anglophone West African context, the terms disability might mean very different things to what they mean in, say, a European context or in an American context or in an East Asian context. But certainly this disability language is often very stigmatized. People do not want to be labeled with disabilities. They do not want to be labeled with diagnoses because of the stigmatization that is attached to that marginalization, exile, and that pushing away in society. But of course, if we can remove that stigmatization, if we can remove that discrimination, then that disability framing can be helpful because it can help people to get support and help people to get support that is beneficial to them to be able to access education, to be able to access employment and jobs that are meaningful, and to support their own communities. And in that medical model, as I say, there are many treatments. So treatments such as methylphenidate, lisdexamfetamine, dexamphetamine are ADHD medications. So medication is almost exclusively used for ADHD. You would not typically see medication being used in autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc. You may see medication being used for people with Tourette's or tic disorder. Those treatments also training, sort of skills training or supportive training can be beneficial, as well as sort of therapeutic interventions, talking interventions, confidence building, self-esteem building, things like that. All of those can also be are positioned in a medical model as a priority. So as you can see with this medical model, it's very much prioritizing the individual. It's saying the individual person, the patient, has a problem and we need to treat that problem. Now, I have some problems with this way of thinking about ADHD and autism and dyslexia, etc. But again, as I say, we'll explore that. Another way to think about neurodevelopmental conditions is that they are often very co-occurring. So what that means is if someone fulfills a criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD, and this is a global statistic, they're significantly more likely to also be autistic. Between 40 and 60% of autistic people also have ADHD. About 35% of people with ADHD are also dyspraxic or have DCD, developmental coordination disorder. And you've got, say, the likes of dyscalculia, which is which I'm going to explain what these conditions mean shortly. But what I want to get across is that there is a lot of complexity and people often have multiple co-occurring challenges in the neurodevelopmental space. So if we take those diagnoses and we'll have a little think about what is meant by these terms, what are the diagnostic criteria for these terms, according to the World Health Organization or the American Psychiatric Association, we can break it down and try and reduce some of that misunderstanding about what are we actually looking at. So for an ADHD diagnosis, what we see is developmentally inappropriate levels of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So what does that look like? This is about having significantly higher levels of difficulties with attentional focus than the average person. Now, that higher levels of attentional focus can also include massively over-focused, hyper-focused attention, where someone is very attentive and they sit and do the same thing for hours and hours and hours. And that can be a massive benefit. That can be a great strength when you are looking at getting work done very quickly. Inattention is also linked with things like higher levels of creativity. So people with ADHD are often seen more in the creative industries. We see that higher achievement and effectiveness in the arts and in drama for people with ADHD. Hyperactivity, this overactive motor system, this constantly bouncing thoughts, that can be very challenging in an educational context. In a school classroom, that can make it really hard. But for athletes, it's a strength, it's a boon. So, and again, that same trait can be difficult in one place and a strength, a massive strength in another. And finally, impulsivity, so doing things without thinking, not thinking through decisions before you make them, again, can link to some difficulties. We see difficulties with things like addiction, but we also see higher likelihood of being an entrepreneur, being a business owner, leading advocacy. Wonderful stuff. So this ADHD diagnosis can both be beneficial and can be difficult depending on the support that we get. For an autism diagnosis, what we're looking for is difficulties around social and emotional communication. So this is things like language and relationships, so difficulties around relational interaction. However, I want to challenge this a little bit because in autistic communities globally, what we actually see is we don't see as much of this difficulty when autistic people are speaking with other autistic people. When people with lower support needs are working with people who don't assume that there's something wrong. So what I mean by that is when we acknowledge that someone's autistic and we allow them to communicate in a way that's helpful for them. This is true of boardrooms and CEOs who I know who are autistic. I know lots of autistic therapists. I know autistic professors, and they're exceptionally good at their jobs, but they might struggle with some of the relational aspects, the sort of conversation, small talk, making friends, things like that. We might see cognitive rigidity, or we expect to see cognitive rigidity. So very black and white thinking. It's either right or it's wrong. May struggle with levels of nuance and sensory sensitivity. So that being very over or under sensitive to certain sensory experiences. So in a stereotypical way, we might see autistic children who struggle with light and sounds, like covering their ears, trying to avoid sensory experiences and avoid sensory input so that to help regulate. Now, again, I do a 6 hour training session on autism. I do a 6 hour training session on ADHD, so I am having to be relatively simplistic for today's talk, but there's a lot more nuance and a lot more depth to this. Dyslexia diagnosis, we see difficulties in mastering writing and reading, which can impact on academic performance. So, and some challenges around verbal memory and processing information. Now, what we know is that if we give smaller bits of information and more sim and smaller tasks, but the same amount of tasks, but in smaller chunks, a lot of this processing difficulty goes away in terms of it's not as impactful. And again, that reduced academic skill, this is not about intelligence. So people who are dyslexic can be incredibly intelligent and can be incredibly successful, but we see reduced outcomes in school and in education because of unfair expectations. They're forced to do things that in a way that doesn't work for their brains. The last few, dyspraxia, around motor performance. So might use the term clumsiness or have a quite poor balance, may struggle with learning to ride a bike, may struggle with gross motor skills like throwing a ball, riding a bike, or fine motor skills, which is things like threading a needle, sewing, tying shoelaces, things like that. And again, with people who are dyspraxic, we see much more creative problem solving, and which is a massive strength for a lot of dyspraxic people, as well as having to work around problems if they struggle with their motor movements and their motor performance, having to find ways to make life work, and then that being beneficial to them by in their problem solving capacities. Dyscalculia is very similar to dyslexia, but is in relation to numbers. So people might really struggle to hold number information, remember phone numbers, remember number data, might struggle with sort of mathematical reasoning or mathematical problem solving. And again, not necessarily a problem if we have access to a calculator, or a phone, if we have access to talking calculators, for instance, or reasonable adjustments, we see better performance. So what I want to get across here is, although these are the diagnoses that we would use and the diagnoses that we see being used, the medical model focuses entirely on the problems. It focuses entirely on what people can't do. But what it doesn't do almost at all is focus on the benefits, on the strengths, and ways in which neurodivergent people with these conditions, can be exceptional workers, can have some major strengths in the context of where they live, where they work, in their families, etc. And then lastly, tics or Tourette syndrome, where we see tics are involuntary movements, sounds, things like snuffs, grunts, sometimes words. So coprolalia is a term we would use to describe someone who says words, typically swear words or slurs, or involuntary words that are deemed socially inappropriate. Um, it's actually much rarer to see coprolalia. Most people with tics and Tourette's don't have coprolalia, that involuntary language, words, but that's what people think about when they think about Tourette syndrome. What we more likely see is sort of involuntary facial movements, or hand movements are the most common. So there are our medical classifications, our medical diagnoses. So that medical perspective, as I've said, focuses heavily on you as an individual, what's wrong with you, what your problems are, etc. And then how can we fix those problems with treatments, with therapies, with interventions. Now, that medical model can be very helpful for a lot of people. It can be really helpful in accessing support. If you have very high needs or very severe symptoms, that medical model is really helpful to you. But as I said, that medical model also comes with a lot of stigma, and it can feel like it blames the person. So then there was the rise of this neurodiversity movement. So a neurodiversity movement is a counter paradigm to that medical model, a counter movement. And I know that the term neurodiversity is used very much in this program, so I would hope that people are relatively aware of this term. But what the neurodiversity perspective does is it comes from a thing called a social model of disability. And a social model of disability says, look, people who are ADHD, autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic, yes, we have difficulties. Yes, we have differences in our brain. However, we also have wonderful strengths. We also have a lot of we are valuable human beings. We give value to our communities, to our workplaces. But one of the biggest problems that we face is not our symptoms, but how people react to us, how people respond to us. The stigmatization and the discrimination we face is often harder to manage and presents more barriers than the actual symptoms of our condition. So that neurodiversity movement frames people with neurodevelopmental conditions or neurodevelopmental differences. It says we are different. We're not disordered. We're not deficient. We're not disabled. We're just different. But the world is predominantly set up for people who are not neurodivergent. This neurodiversity movement will focus more heavily on the strengths. It'll focus more heavily on what people with ADHD are typically good at, often better at than the general public. It'll look for the strengths of autistic people, where we see autistic people really shine For instance, in maths, engineering, and science, we see a much higher proportion of autistic people at the highest levels of maths, engineering, and science. We see a lot of ADHD in comedians, in people who are on stage a lot, in public speakers like myself. We see more ADHD in um, the emergency services. We see more ADHD in uh, business owners and entrepreneurs. So that neurodiversity movement celebrates that, and it goes, look, we are brilliant if we are given the right support. We are exceptional with the right support. But it doesn't ignore the difficulties. It still says, look, we understand that you have difficulties. As I said, that neurodiversity perspective says that we experience disability, we experience difficulty by the barriers that are put in place in society. So the barriers that we face are what disable us more than our traits. It questions some of these expectations. Is it, for instance, in a classroom, is it fair to expect a child to sit and pay attention and listen for a full day at school when they have ADHD? Now, my argument would say no, it's not fair because they will not be able to do that. They will fail if you expect them to sit and listen for 6 hours. However, if you give more regular breaks, if you give more support, if you allow the person with ADHD to get up and run around and spend some of that energy, then we see better performance in education. As I say, I had a very hard time at school myself, in a Western educational system, and was told that I would not succeed in education. And now I have a PhD, and I have a PhD because of this different framing, this acknowledgement of my strengths. This neurodiversity movement is also often led by neurodivergent people. We see people with these conditions at the front of this movement, saying, like myself, saying, look, we can be successful with the right support. And what's one of the things I love about this program, about the advocacy program, is about centering neurodivergent people to improve the experiences of neurodivergent people within your communities. I think that's so important to for people, for autistic people, for ADHD people to see others fighting for their rights, fighting for their needs, fighting for their validation, for them to be seen. It's very important. So as I say, if we compare those two paradigms, the biomedical paradigm is very much about deficit disorder, has a biological basis. It talks about brain differences. It talks about genetics, and it focuses on treatment, but it can be reductionist. It can ignore some of the good parts about being neurodivergent. This neurodiversity paradigm does the opposite. It celebrates diversity, it celebrates identity, it celebrates difference. It acknowledges that getting people with lived experience to talk about their experience is important, and it focuses on strengths and advocacy. But there is also a criticism to that neurodiversity perspective because it can feel like it minimizes the experience. I'll talk a bit later about the term superpower that's often might be used in this space. And when we use terms like superpower, that can be problematic, shall we say. I'll explain why later. So then, when I was preparing for this talk, I was speaking to a friend of mine, and I did quite a bit of research, reading a lot of the research that's out available right now about Afrocentric perspectives of neurodivergence. So, neurodiversity within an African perspective, and also an additional way of knowing, an additional way, another way of thinking about neurodiversity. And I really appreciate as well the pre-session work that people sent in because it helped to frame some of that research into your own lived experiences. So some considerations around these models, these two models from an African perspective, is this interplay between the cultural and spiritual beliefs, because when we talk about ADHD and autism, and what we call like lay experience, so the experiences of communities, uh, there's often this cultural element or this spiritual element to some of these diagnoses, some of which can be positive, some of which can be more negative and even more stigmatizing. So I think the medical model and the social model, the neurodiversity model, can incorporate this cultural and spiritual element. And again, as I said at the very start of this, none of these perspectives are right or wrong, but it's about working in creating a perspective to talk about neurodivergence and neurodiversity in a way that's helpful in your community, because it's going to be different to across the delegate group today, where each of you live are going to have very different cultural considerations. There's a lot of evidence for a much higher amount of stigma around neurodiversity and around neurodivergence. And again, if I go back, if I think what we've seen on a global perspective is that we often see a very high level of stigma that's associated with maybe some misunderstanding and misinformation around what ADHD autism is. So as we develop education and understanding around ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, tics and Tourette's, as we demonstrate that people with these conditions can also have wonderful lives, can also be very successful, when we can use where we can point to people in positions of power or influence or success who are openly neurodivergent. I think that helps to reduce the stigma when we see, autistic autistic actors, African leaders who are openly neurodivergent, or academics, or um, people within media. I think that really helps to reduce that stigma alongside that educational piece around what actually is ADHD. It's not naughty boys in a classroom. It's a condition that impacts about 5% of the population of the world, and it's as important for men as well as women as well as adults. It is a global phenomena, but most people with ADHD don't know they have ADHD, or are scared to talk about it for the fear of that stigma. There was something I read a little about lower access to support and opportunities. And again, this is something that we're seeing across the board globally as well, but of course, it's going to be unique to your cultural context in that support and opportunities are in part related to culture. And what I mean by that is, as we reduce the stigma around neurodiversity, as we are able to have more open conversations about the strengths of neurodivergent people as well as the difficulties, we can also improve support just by doing that, by speaking to neurodivergent people and saying, I see you. I see you, I see your strengths, I see your struggles, and I understand that it's harder for you, but that you can still be successful. That can be an incredibly positive supportive intervention. If there are people who have much higher support needs, so people who may need like much more caring needs because they're autistic and they have very high, as I say, very severe sort of traits, then that lower access to support and opportunities can be a bigger barrier. As I said earlier, the misunderstanding and misinterpretation of symptoms came up both in the research and in your pre-session task. Of misunderstanding leads to higher levels of stigma, and that misinterpretation of symptoms leads to that misunderstanding. So as we develop more understanding about what is ADHD, what do people with ADHD, what experiences do they typically have, when is hyperactivity a benefit, a positive? When is it challenging? How can we reduce the impact of hyperactivity in a classroom, in a boardroom, in a workplace, in the family, in the wider community? That can be so powerful, because I firmly believe in overall community approaches to neurodiversity support, because it's not enough that just the doctors and the professionals are talking about it. It's not enough that the researchers are talking about it. It's not enough that politicians are talking about it. It's both from the ground up and from the top down, of that whole system approach to developing understanding of people and their needs. And whether a medical model is helpful for that, or a social neurodiversity model, or a model which straddles those things in the middle and brings in some of the cultural and spiritual beliefs in your area, that can work. And as I said, there's no right way to do this, but certainly doing it effectively can change lives. And the last point that came up was about culturally sensitive advocacy, about being an advocate is really important in this space. Being someone who fights for the needs and the rights of neurodivergent people, but it needs to be done in this culturally sensitive way, which is what I hope I'm doing today by really positioning the the tension of ways of thinking here, because there is a lot of tension around what's the most helpful way to understand neurodivergence when it's so different across the globe. But what we do know, and the evidence in across the globe, is that early intervention is one of the most effective things. If we can recognize that people are neurodivergent or have a neurodivergent condition early, then we can shift expectations, we can give appropriate support, we can give beneficial support, and we can help someone to be more likely to be successful later in life. And that's, as I say, true across the globe. Um, for people with ADHD, access to medication, access to treatment, access to support is important. But what seems to be the most important thing when you look at the research is access to understanding, a helpful way to understand yourself. As I said, I was diagnosed at 5 years old. I've lived my life knowing I was ADHD, and so my expectations of myself have been different. I do not expect myself to remember birthdays and names and various things. I struggle with administrative tasks, but I'm exceptional in other contexts. I've done talks to 19,000 people live. I'm very productive. So that nuanced understanding of self that comes from a label or a diagnosis can be really beneficial in the long term. So I mentioned this term earlier, and I didn't see as much of this conversation in an African context, but we certainly see this in the sort of the social media space at the moment about the neurodivergence, ADHD, autism being portrayed or talked about as if it's a superpower. And there's, I think it's not so simple as that, because I think it depends. I think your ADHD traits, a person's autistic traits can be incredibly beneficial in one place and very challenging in another. So these superpower narratives, talking about ADHD as a superpower, is not particularly helpful if someone needs a lot of support and has very high support needs, because that can make it feel like their needs are being ignored. That can make it feel like we are being overly positive about how hard life can be. And this can also come across as quite infantilizing, that if people are telling you you have a superpower. And then this question also comes up of, well, who gets to decide what a superpower is? What parts of ADHD or autism are allowed to be a superpower? And the answers to this vary across who you ask. I could ask 100 people today about whether they see their autism or their ADHD, etc., as a superpower, and I'll get wildly different answers. Because for some people, it is a superpower. They will use the term superpower to describe themselves. For some neurodivergent people, they are the best in their field globally. Some of the best engineers, the best comedians, the best entrepreneurs are neurodivergent or ADHD autistic, predominantly, or dyslexic. Some of the the most successful people I've ever met are neurodivergent. And that what they will say is that they are successful because they are autistic. They're successful because they have ADHD, not in spite of it. And I think people like this can be really good role models for young people who might be struggling to know where they fit. If we think about athletes, there are quite a lot of athletes now sort of coming out and talking about their ADHD diagnoses or their autism diagnoses. Um, and as I've said throughout this talk so far, is that neurodivergent conditions can bring some exceptional strengths, and potential, but mostly when someone is well supported, when someone is accepted in their community, when they are accepted for who they are, when they are acknowledged as an important person, when their difficulties are recognized and seen and not ignored, but their strengths are also seen. Their their effectiveness is also seen. As I said, I am a professor of nursing and I teach mental health nursing. And many of my students are neurodivergent. Many students are ADHD or autistic, and they are exceptional nurses. They are brilliant nurses, and they will be brilliant nurses. And part of the reason why they're brilliant is, for instance, their ADHD makes them so exciting and bubbly and passionate and full of energy, which can be really helpful. But they also need support to be able to complete the course. They also need support around some aspects of the job. So again, is it a superpower? Sometimes. If I take my own personal journey, I see my hyperactivity when I'm on stage, when I'm delivering public lectures or when I'm delivering an 8-hour training session. I'm full of energy all day. I'm constantly bouncing around the room. I'm walking around. I'm having a great time. I'm very passionate. I help people stay engaged. But that same hyperactivity can be difficult in a place where you're expected to be quiet, in a space where you need to sit quietly, like say a library or in an exam. So being able to do reasonable adjustments, like adjusting exam timetables for young children and young people, or in people's jobs. Again, if you have ADHD and you have to go into a 3-hour meeting at your job, that's a nightmare. That's a disaster. So in meetings, ensuring that there's breaks so that, well, that's helpful for everyone, but it's disproportionately helpful for ADHDers. It's much more helpful than average for people with ADHD. So again, we're looking for that balance between what's support and recognition of strength. And again, so like it keeps coming back to that core question, doesn't it? Of which way of thinking about neurodiversity is right for me? You might ask yourself this question: which way of thinking is right for your community, for where you work, for the change you want to see? It depends. It depends on what's going to be the most helpful way to frame it to be able to support people. Because even in the academic literature, there is disagreement around what is the most helpful way. I recently wrote a research paper, which is open access. Anyone can read it for free on this very problem, on this medical versus neurodiversity model problem of how should we think about this? So I'm very happy for people to read that. And what I want to sit with for the last portion of my sort of talk, the last 10 minutes or so, is what the outcome can be if we get this wrong. So Dr. Russell Barkley is a prominent ADHD scholar. He says that around 50 to 70% of ADHD children will be utterly rejected by their peers by the second grade by year 2. So this is around 7 years old, 6 years old. Yeah. And for me, this is one of the biggest problems that I saw in when working with children and with families and with adults. It wasn't the symptoms of ADHD that were the biggest problem. It wasn't the symptoms of autism. It wasn't the symptoms of their condition. It was the stigma and the rejection that was the biggest problem for so many people. And what I want to just go into is a little bit about my story and about my own personal journey, because I find stories and journeys a helpful way to think about these things. As I say, I was diagnosed when I was 5 years old, and I really struggled in school. I struggled to pay attention. I always loved learning. I adored learning, and I was full of energy, but I had a lot of symptoms. I had a lot of difficulties, but I was told when I was 5 years old that I would not be successful in my life. At such a young age, I was told I couldn't be successful because I have ADHD. And I was ostracized by my peers. I was bullied. The teachers were deeply unfair to me. I described the entire journey through education as traumatic and institutionally abusive and problematic, which is why I fight for children and young people today. And I just want to sit with like the types of ways we can think about certainly neurodivergent children is what do we write about them? How do we think about them? As one teacher said to me in one of my books, Tom finds it difficult to pay attention and sit still and listen with an unhappy face. But of course, I find it difficult to pay attention and sit still and listen because I have ADHD. I struggle to pay attention and sit still and listen now as a professor. And so, but it's not as much of a barrier to me now because I understand that, so I can put things in place to make it less likely to be impactful. So again, when your traits are seen purely as problems, it has a negative impact on self-esteem, on belief in yourself. As another teacher said, oh dear, perhaps we are going to have to curb this streak of independence so that Tom isn't quite so noticeable. His interest and genuine enthusiasm in the world around him is great to see and should help him gain approval. So in my educational journey, I was told to don't be independent. Being an independent thinker or an independent person is a problem. And now my career is about me being an independent thinker. My career is about challenging the status quo, about supporting the disenfranchised. Tom likes to be the center of attention and can be quite disruptive to achieve this. This is true. I do enjoy being the center of attention. And I'm an academic, a lecturer, a teacher, and a public speaker now. Liking being the center of attention is beneficial to me because it's allowed me to have the success and the platform that I have. Again, thinking about other words that are used to describe neurodivergent children: frustrating, lazy, having no targets met. If we constantly tell people who are neurodivergent everything that they're bad at and everything that they struggle with, they're going to feel terrible. They're more likely to feel sad. They're more likely to have mental health difficulties. Whereas if we celebrate them, the opposite happens. Tom should not be allowed to use his disorder as an excuse for unacceptable behavior. But of course, these diagnoses are about atypical behavior. These diagnoses are used to explain why children might behave differently. So of course we can use these labels to understand different behavior. Tom's a bright boy, likes to be the center of attention, struggles to sit still and listen, has little regard for socially acceptable behavior. Again, all of these things are filled, all of these report cards are filled with negativity. A goal that was given to me: Tom will not use his hands to fiddle with any possessions or physically touch other children. Yeah, which again is a goal that as a 5-year-old with ADHD, I would fail because I could not do this. Fidgeting and fiddling is part of hyperactivity. It's part of what we call a regulatory strategy, where if someone with ADHD is fidgeting and fiddling, it helps improve attentional focus. It helps them pay attention more. That's a beneficial thing. But if we tell them off or we punish them for doing that, then we are disabling them. We are making life harder for them. And children start to feel sad. I get told off a lot. I need to improve my concentration because I get distracted a lot. As children, we internalize whatever messages we are given. So if we focus heavily on what someone who's autistic or ADHD can't do, they will internalize that message and they will believe whatever message we give them. But if we give them a message of what they can do, where they are great, well, we can do something magical. And this is what my teacher, Mr. Spurs, did for me. I had one advocate. Well, I had two advocates, but one was my mother. But Mr. Spurs was a teacher who always believed in me, and he pushed me, and he celebrated what I was great at, and he told me what was wonderful about me. He said, I'm very strong in the subject. I'm keen to ask sensible questions. I pick up new skills very quickly. What Mr. Spurs did, this one advocate, this one teacher, this one support that I had, really celebrated my strengths and focused on my strengths. And what he recognized when I was 15 years old, I was put forward and accepted into the National Academy for Gifted and Talented Youth. I was put onto the Young Gifted and Talented program. I was recognized as being high IQ, cognitively gifted when I was 15 years old because Mr. Spurs and my mum recognized what I was brilliant at. I'm intelligent, very intelligent. But for so many years, everyone focused on what I couldn't do, what I was bad at. They focused on my hyperactivity, my inattention, and my impulsivity, my ADHD symptoms. They focused more on that and less on what I could be, my potential. And just to give you a little bit of an insight of what my life has looked like since, I was recognized as gifted and talented in 2006. I did my first degree in ancient history, which I did because I was interested in the topic. I did my second degree in mental health nursing. I got a first class honours in that degree. I was awarded the Heath Award for Nursing Excellence, which is about going above and beyond as a student. I became a lecturer and an assistant professor and did my PhD. My PhD is on the experiences of parents of ADHD children. How do we understand parents? And how can we help parents of ADHD children? And now I am an international public speaker. I've spoken live to over 100,000 people. I was a child who was told that I would not be successful when I was 5 years old because I had ADHD. And now I am, by all of my merits, incredibly successful. I influence policy. I have PhD students. I write research. I have a home. I have a wife. I have a child. I have a very fulfilling life. And what I want us to do, and what I wanted to do with this first introduction to neurodiversity for this program, I just wanted to sit with the potential of, if we change the story about how we talk about neurodivergent people, if we create a more positive framing, if we find a way to reduce the stigma, if we can reduce stigma and improve education and improve access and improve support, and we can change the story within your communities, within your context, about what ADHD means and about how much potential people have, then we literally save lives. We save lives and we empower people to make a massive difference. And sometimes it only takes just one person to be able to do that. And I believe from the things I've heard about this group that we have people in this group who have the power to do that, who have the power to save and change lives around the context of neurodivergence. And I always put a little picture of my mum and my mother in my presentations because she's the reason why I'm so successful, because of her support and her advocacy. and that is me in my PhD graduation. And that's my talk. That is an introduction to the concepts of neurodiversity. Of course, there is a lot more complexity that can be had here. There's a lot more discussion that can exist. But I didn't want to overcomplicate too many things, but just wanted to help give people in the room some language, some models, some ways to think about this, and just to work out what's going to be helpful for you. And what I'd love to hear, certainly in the little task I want to give you for after this session by the end of the week, is what you're going to take away from this session. That's one thing, but what I'm really interested in is what do you think will be helpful in your community specifically? Because it fills me with so much joy to know that the little boy who I was at 5 years old has the potential to reach children like him in Sierra Leone, in the Gambia, in Ghana, in Nigeria. What a wonderful thing. And that's what I want to hear, is just a little bit of writing, a little bit of what do you think this is going to look like? What's going to be helpful in your community? And I'm happy to take a few questions if that's okay.
Yes, it's okay. We can take a few questions.
Yeah, I'm also happy to answer questions on LinkedIn and through email as well. We have, is it Benjamin? We have a Omawunmi.
Hello, good evening, Dr. Chum.
Good evening.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for a wonderful session given so far. My questions will vary, but I'm going to try as much as possible to make them compact so you can answer them all at once.
Yeah,
So, I want to ask a question as regards the stigma. Um, I know from your story and what you've shared, we've we have a bit the disparity in the experience of stigma is not much for me. I am also an undiagnosed neurodivergent person, and I'm also raising two neurodivergent children. My firstborn is going to be 23, and he's a scholarship student in a school in Scotland, and he was diagnosed of ADHD at the age of 6.
yeah,
But as of now, he's in the top three of his program at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Um, he's a two-time scholarship student, which means his neurodivergence actually did not become how would I put it, a problem to his
mm,
learning. Then my other child, who is also neurodivergent, he was diagnosed at the he's almost 4 this year, and he was diagnosed at 18 months. So for me, while I was in school, I had dyscalculia too. Anything
yeah,
I had to do with numbers gave me jitters. I had to be bounced from one class to the other between grade 10 and 12. I wanted to be in sciences, but because my numbers were bad, I had struggled with physics, I struggled with maths, so I couldn't do well there, and I ended up in the arts.
yeah,
So while I was in school, I found it hard to wait my turn when I have to speak. I found it hard to express myself. At some point, my smartness or my intelligence was a problem to my mates because they felt like they gave me a name. They called me I too know, meaning like something close to a smarty pants.
yeah,
So my intelligence or my intellectual capability was almost a problem to the people in my class. So I always felt like I didn't fit in any place. Like I was a square peg in a round hole.
Yes.
And this followed me all through life for over 40 years of my life.
Yeah.
My question now is about the stigma. How do we, and I'm sure there are also people in my community in Nigeria who's had similar problems, who's had similar challenges as mine. Now,
Yeah.
one of my challenges about talking about neurodivergence to people in Nigeria or to people in my community or people in my own primary network is because already a whole lot of people look at me like I have loose screws, like I'm cuckoo, like I'm not normal, like I'm a crazy person.
Mm.
It has so much built some vocal redundance for me.
Yeah.
Because I just feel like, oh, by the time I come online or I use my social media to talk about neurodivergence and I disclose that I have it, some people will be like, oh yeah, we thought as much. Oh, we know, oh, she's a nutcase. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm feeling like by the time I come out of my closet and say to people, this is what I am or this is what I have, the point is there's no going back when I go out there to say. So I'm like, so what are the consequences that I might have to face when I go through this? So
Yeah.
how do I also, since I want to be an advocate, how do I also make people who are neurodivergent see that um, it's better to come out with it so you can know how to be supported?
Wonderful question, and a lot to unpack. What I'm going to do, I've been writing myself a few notes. I'm going to unpack a few different things that you said, which I think will be helpful for everyone, and then I'm going to answer your question. So you talked about how your son was diagnosed at 6 and then your second son was diagnosed at 18 months. What we know from neurodiversity and the neurodivergent conditions, so everyone's aware, they are the most hereditable conditions in psychiatry. So what that means is if you have someone with ADHD, there's a very high likelihood that one of their children will also have ADHD or be autistic or be neurodivergent in some way. So these are conditions that are very hereditable. They run in families, and often what you see is, as we've seen there, is wonderful families of neurodivergent people. So you've got one of the parents being neurodivergent, and then often one or both or multiple children, brothers, sisters, very, very common. So that's one thing I wanted to get across that I didn't in my talk. That neurodivergence runs in families. The other thing that you said was that you ended up going into the arts. Another thing that we see is for neurodivergent people who might struggle in standardized education, end up going into the arts because the social expectations in the arts are different. The workflow is different. You're not expected in the arts to work 9 till 5, Monday to Friday. You work when you want. Your work is more free flow. It's more creative. It's more exploratory, and again, that can be really liberating for many neurodivergent people. So one potential benefit way to help people who are neurodivergent is just to celebrate non-traditional job roles. Maybe they're never going to work in an office. Maybe they're never going to work in a 9 to 5 job or in sales. Maybe with ADHD, they might be brilliant in sales, but it's about being more flexible and being more curious about what other types of jobs and career pathways people can have. And I want to your actual question. How do you fight the stigma when you self-disclose and people are already like against you? This is something that we still see in the UK. This is something that we still see across the States. This is something we still see in that like, sort of Eurocentric perspective of neurodiversity as well as a global South perspective. Um, for me, it's a two-pronged approach. You will have noticed I self-disclosed immediately at the start of this training session. And the reason why I do that is I try to be a positive role model in this space and to immediately challenge some of those expectations of I've got ADHD, but I have a PhD. I've got ADHD, but I'm a professor. Like that doesn't that already starts breaking down barriers and starts breaking down some of the stigma because well, people don't expect that. So if you find that there's a problem or a challenge to you specifically within your community, then I would start thinking about who else can you draw from, who maybe people in the community also like respect. I'm thinking about like are there any other leaders in the community who are comfortable self-disclosing, people in positions of power, um, or thinking wider to in the media, in sports and athletics, in when we say, oh, one of the things I often do when I'm talking about, say, the Olympics, I'll say, oh, Michael Phelps, the best swimmer in the world ever, has ADHD. Simone Biles, one of the best gymnasts we've ever seen in the world, has ADHD. And I can pull from all of these actors and actresses and academics and professors and entrepreneurs who have ADHD or who are autistic as examples of just how incredible life can be and how productive people can be and how successful people can be. But it's also to acknowledge that it's not all your responsibility either. You know, for some people, there are, even in my community, there's people who say ADHD doesn't exist and they're not going to listen to anything I say. And I go, okay. I don't try and convince those people because it's a waste of my time and emotional effort. What I do is I try to convince the people whose decisions matter more, policymakers, people who make decisions, the head teachers of schools or the school teachers are more helpful to, support and convince them than it is to convince someone who just lives on my street, because otherwise you're constantly fighting and you have to look after yourself as an activist and as an advocate, because it's easy to burn out by fighting for it all the time. So it's almost picking your battles. You said something as well about convincing people that it's good to come out and self-disclose. I think it is for some people. I think for others it's not. And what I mean by that is some people aren't in a position where they're safe to self-disclose, where the stigma that they face might be really bad and really difficult for them. So to be able to disclose, we need to be psychologically safe. We need to be safe enough to disclose, which is why when I do corporate training, so I train corporate organizations on how to make environments in their corporation so it's more comfortable for people to self-disclose, to ask for help, because it can be really scary doing that because of that stigma. So again, I think it's not all your responsibility. Doing it where you can, picking your battles, and finding others in the wider community, because as a collection, as a movement, more voices is going to be helpful. So that's how I'd answer your question. I'm thinking, obviously there's, I could also talk about that for longer. Someone asks, is ADHD curable? No. So none of the neurodevelopmental conditions are curable, and the terms cure is something that we typically wouldn't use in this space, because what we're saying is you're born with a brain that processes information in a different way, that experiences the world slightly differently, and so it's not curable. You can't get rid of ADHD. You can't know to stop being autistic. But what you can do is manage some of the symptoms that are problematic to you. So, for instance, ADHD medication helps with improving attentional focus. But so does regular exercise, so does eating well, so does sleeping well, so does some of the therapy interventions. So, looking after yourself and your body generally is helpful. So yeah, I wouldn't use it. I don't use the term cure, and I wouldn't expect to see the word cure, but supported is the word. Helpful interventions is more the language I would use. You mentioned earlier, early intervention plays a role in the support received by the child. So working on a project on EdTech for neurodivergent children. How do we go about this solution? So you have so my understanding is you have an educational technology solution that supports neurodivergent children in school to access their learning. So that can also help to spot signs. Great, wonderful. And again, this is the types of things that, as more and more of these interventions and more of the conversation enters the popular discourse into the mainstream conversation, we will see shifts over time. even in the UK, in the last 10 years, I have seen a monumental change in how ADHD and autism are talked about. They are much that you see it being talked about on the news all of the time. It's you see more policies being written about it. It's a very much in the public discourse now. 10 years ago, it wasn't. So these things do take time and they take concerted, consistent effort to truly sort of flourish and bloom. So how to drive impact? Well, we drive impact by making a product that's good, making a package that's helpful, making something that people genuinely find beneficial, and then just building social proof, building that proof of helping people with having a mission to support and help people, showing that it works, and then rolling it out elsewhere. So again, it's like often these things are like a boulder picking up speed down a hill. Pushing it and getting these things off the marker can be very slow at first, but over time we see a massive difference, and we will see that momentum. Again, even just in this room, we've got a room full of people and a program full of people who are wanting to make differences, which is so cool. Practical ways to support ADHD people within an African context. I'm going to give you the most simple, because I think the most simple is the most important. And the most simple is to just treat them well. Treat them like human beings, to speak with people and understand what they want, and to challenge some of the stigma around what it means to be neurodivergent. Because structural interventions are helpful, systemic interventions are helpful, training schools, training policymakers, training politicians, all that's really helpful. I do that sort of stuff. That's my job. I do that. But the thing that I think makes a massive difference when I used to be a nurse, and what I also do is just help people feel seen, help people feel validated, help people know that you see the potential in them. Because if they're in a community where everyone else sees them as weird or odd or stupid or broken, sometimes just having one person really believe in them can make such a difference, can be life-saving. Obviously there's a lot more we can do, but for me, that's the number one thing. I remember I was at a conference and it was Rory Bremner, who's a professional comedian, and he said the most important thing that a parent can do to support their neurodivergent child is just love them. Just love them with all of your being and love them for who they are, because we can't force them to change. You're not going to stop an autistic person being autistic. They will always be autistic. But the difference is, are they going to be autistic and traumatized because of how we treated them? Or are they going to be autistic and loved? And who's more likely to succeed? But yeah, a lot to think about. It's been an absolute joy delivering a talk today. And again, I can see in the types of questions, the passion and the enthusiasm and the personal investment, as you said earlier, about being a parent of a neurodivergent child, it gives you more personal investment in this. I want the world to be better for my child. I want the world to be better for everyone's children. And as long as we stick to that sort of mission, over time we see huge difference. And I think I will end there, because I'm going to go and after this talk, it's nearly 6:30. I'm going to go and do bedtime with my toddler, because we need to show up as parents. That's the most important thing in my life.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Tom. This has been a very interesting conversation. I learned quite a lot, and I'm sure everyone here did. Um, I've also noted the assignment we'll share with everyone and those that could not join due to network issue. And we'll send back to you via email, just like we sent the previous. Yeah. So I don't think we have any other question, but this was a fire session actually. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And for anyone who's interested, I post on LinkedIn about ADHD related and neurodiversity related content 3 times a week. I have a blog where I write about neurodivergence. I have research papers that are all open access. Anyone can read them. I don't believe in that scientific information should be behind a paywall. And I do this work. I'm doing more international work over this year, and spreading the word and spreading understanding and awareness wherever will have us. But take care and have a brilliant rest of the course, everyone.
Yes, thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.